my channel. I just finished recording, as you see. I just finished recording the Ickabog and many others. But the Ickabog chapter 18 and 19. So, right. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Yes. So now I will be reading chapter 20 and 21. 20 and 21. Shiny nose. Man, I could really light up the sky. Santa should use me as a reindeer. Okay. This is just not. They keep popping out. Okay, let's just get started. Let's get started. Okay, chapter 20. Medals for Beamish and Buttons. When King Fred woke next morning and was informed that his chief advisor had retired at this critical moment in the country's history, he was furious. It came as a great relief to know that Lord Spittleworth would be taken over, because Fred knew that Spittleworth understood the grave danger facing the kingdom. Though feeling safer now that he was back in his palace, with its high walls and cannon-mounted turrets, its portcullis, and its moat, Fred was unable to shake off the shock of his trip. He stayed shut up in his private apartments and had all his meals brought to him on golden trays. Instead of going hunting, he paced up and down on his thick carpet, reliving his awful adventure in the north and meeting only his two best friends, who were careful to keep his fears alive. On the third day after their return from the marshlands, Spittleworth entered the king's private apartments with a somber face and announced that the soldiers who had been sent back to the marsh to find out what happened to Private Noby Buttons had discovered nothing but his blood-stained shoes, a single horseshoe, and few well-gnawed bones. The king turned white and sat down hard on the satin sofa. Oh, how dreadful, Private Buttons. Remind me which one he was. Which one was he? Young man Freckles, only son of a widowed mother, said Spittleworth, the newest recruit to the royal guard, and such a promising boy. Tragic, really. And the worst of it is, between Beamish and Buttons, the Ickabog has developed a taste for human flesh, precisely as your majesty predicted. It is really astonishing, if I may say so, how your majesty grasped the danger from the first. But what it is to be done, Spittleworth. If the monster is hungry for more human prey, leave it all to me, Your Majesty, said Spittleworth soothingly. I'm chief advisor, you know. I am at work day and night to keep the kingdom safe. I'm so glad Aaron would appoint you as a successor, Spittleworth said. Fred, what would I do without you? Tish, pish, Your Majesty. Tis an honor and serve the gracious a king. Now we ought to discuss tomorrow's funerals. We're intending to bury what's left of Buttons next to Major Beamish. It is to be a state occasion, you know, if with plenty of pomp and ceremony, and I think it would be very nice touch if you could present the medal for outstanding bravery against the deadly Ickabog to relatives of the dead man. Oh, is there a medal? Said Fred. Certainly there is, sire, and that reminds me, you haven't yet received your own. From an inner pocket, Spittleworth pulled out the most gorgeous gold medal, almost as large as a saucer. Embossed upon the medal was a monster with gleaming ruby eyes, which was being fought by a handsome, muscular man wearing a crown. The whole thing was suspended from the scarlet velvet ribbon. Mine, said King, wide-eyed. But of course, sire, said Spittleworth. Did Your Majesty not plunge your sword into the monster's loathsome neck? We all remember it happening, sire. King Fred fingered the heavy gold medal. Though he said nothing, he was undergoing a silent struggle. Fred's honesty had piped up in a small, clear voice. It didn't happen like that, you know. It didn't. You saw the Ickabog in the fog. You dropped your sword and you ran away. You never stabbed it. You were never near enough. But Fred's cowardice blustered louder than his honesty. You've already agreed with Spittleworth that that's what happened. What a fool you'll look like if you admit you ran away. And Fred Vanity spoke out loud of all. After all, I was the one who led the hunt for the Ickabog. I was the one who saw it first. I deserve this medal, and it will stand out beautifully against the black funeral suit. So Fred said, yes, Spittleworth, it all happened just as you said, naturally. One doesn't like to boast. Your Majesty's modesty is legendary, said Spittleworth, bowing low to hide his smirk. The following day was declared a national day of mourning in honor of Ickabog's victim. Crowds lined the streets to watch Major Beamish and Private Button's coffin pass on wagons drawn by plumed black horses. King Fred rode behind the coffins on a high-jet horse with the Medal of Outstanding Bravery against the deadly Ickabog, bouncing on his chest and reflecting the sunlight so brightly that it hurt the eyes of the crowd. Behind the king walked Mrs. Beamish and Bert, also dressed in black, and behind them came a howling old woman in a ginger wig, who had been introduced to them as Miss Button's Nobie's mother. Oh, my Nobie, she wailed as she walked. Oh, down with the awful Ickabog who killed my poor Nobie. The coffins were lowered into graves. A national anthem was played by the king's buglers. Button's coffin was particularly heavy because it had been filled with bricks. The odd-looking Miss Buttons wailed and cursed the Ickabog again, while 10 sweating men lowered her son's coffin into the ground. Miss Beamish and Bert stood quietly weeping. Then King Fred called the grieving relatives forward to receive their men's medals. Spittleworth hadn't been prepared to spend as much money on Beamish and the imaginary Buttons as he'd been spent on the king, so their medals were made of silver rather than gold. However, it made an affecting ceremony, especially as Miss Buttons was so overcome that she fell to the ground and kissed the king's boots. Miss Beamish and Bert walked home from the funeral, and crowds parted respectfully to let them pass. Only once did Miss Beamish pause, and that was when her old friend Mr. Dovetail stepped out of the crowd to tell her how sorry he was. The two embraced. Daisy wanted to say something to Bert, but the whole crowd was staring, and she couldn't even catch his eye because he was scolding at his feet. Before she knew it, her father had released Miss Beamish, and Daisy watched her best friend and his mother walk out of sight. Once they were back in their cottage, Miss Beamish threw herself face down on her bed, where she sobbed and sobbed. Bert tried to comfort her, but nothing worked, so he took his father's medal into his own bedroom and placed it on the mantelpiece. Only when he stood back, he looked at it, he realized that he'd placed his father's medal right beside the wooden Ickabog that Mr. Dovetail had carved for him so long ago. Until this moment, Bert hadn't connected the toy Ickabog with the way his father had died. Now he lifted the wooden model from its shelf, placed it on the floor, and picked up a poker and mashed the toy Ickabog to splinters. Then he picked up the remnants of the shattered toy and threw them into the fire. As he watched the flames leap higher and higher, he vowed that one day, when he was old enough, he'd hunt down the Ickabog and revenge himself upon the monster that had killed his father. Chapter 21. Professor Fraudysham? I think it is what it is. Fraudysham. Okay. The morning after the funeral, Spittleworth knocked on the door of the king's apartment again and entered carrying a lot of scrolls, which he let fall onto the table where the king sat. Spittleworth said Fred, who was still wearing his medal for outstanding bravery against the deadly Ickabog and had dressed in a scarlet suit, the better to show it off. These cakes aren't as good as usual. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Your Majesty, said Spittleworth. I thought it right for the widow Beamish to take a few days off of work. These are the work of the under pastry chef. Well, they're chewy, said Fred, dropping half his folderol fancy back on his plate. And what are all those scrolls? These, sire, are suggestions for improving the kingdom's defense against the Ickabog, said Spittleworth. Excellent, excellent, said King Fred, moving the cakes and the teapot aside. To make more room for Spittleworth pulled up a chair. The very first thing to be done, Your Majesty, was to find out as much as we could about the Ickabog itself, the better to discover how to defeat it. Well, yes, but how, Spittleworth? The monster is a mystery. Everyone thought it is a fantasy all these years. That, forgive me, is where Your Majesty is wrong, said Spittleworth. By dint of ceaseless searching, I've managed to find the foremost Ickabog experts in cornucopia. Lord Flapoon is waiting with him in the hall. With Your Majesty's permission, bring him in, do, said Fred excitedly. So Spittleworth left the room and returned shortly afterward with Lord Flapoon and little old man with snowy white hair and spectacles so thick that his eyes had vanished almost into nothingness. This, sire, is Professor Fraudysham, said Flapoon, as the mole-like little man made a deep bow to the king. What he doesn't know about Ickabog isn't worth knowing. How is it that I've never heard of you before, Professor Fraudysham? Asked the king, who was thinking that if he'd known the Ickabog was real enough, to have its own expert, he'd never have gone looking for it in the first place. I live a retired life, Your Majesty, said Professor Fraudysham, with a second bow. So few people believe the Ickabog that I've formed the habit of keeping my knowledge to myself. King Fred was satisfied with this answer, which was a relief to Spittleworth, because Professor Frodisham was no more real than a private Noby Buttons, or indeed old widow Buttons in her ginger wig, who'd howled at Noby's funeral. The truth was that beneath the wigs and the glasses, Professor Frodisham and Widow Buttons were the same person. Lord Spittleworth Butler, who was called Otto Scrumble, and looked after Lord Spittleworth estate while he lived at the palace, like his master Scrumble would do anything for gold, and had agreed to impersonate both the widow and the professor for 100 ducats. So, what can you tell us about the Ickabog Professor Frodisham? Asked the king. Well, let's see, said the pretend professor, who'd been told by Spittleworth what he ought to say. It's as tall as 2 horses, if not taller, interrupted Fred, whose nightmares had featured a gigantic Ickabog ever since he'd returned from the marchlands. If, as your majesty says, not taller, agreed Frodisham, I should estimate that a medium-sized Ickabog would be as tall as 2 horses, whereas a large specimen might reach the size of, let's see, 2 elephants, suggested the king. 2 elephants, agreed Frodisham. And with eyes like lamps or glowing balls of fire, suggested the king. The very image I was about to employ, sire, said Frodisham. And can the monster really speak in a human tongue? Asked Fred, in whose nightmares the monster whispered, the king. I want the king. Where are you, little king? As it crept through the dark streets toward the palace. Yes, indeed, said Frodisham, with another low bow. We believe that Ickabog learned to speak human by taking people prisoners before disemboweling and eating its victims. We believe it forces them to give it English lessons. Suffering saints, what savagery, whispered Fred, who turned pale. Moreover, said Frodisham, the Ickabog has a long and vengeful memory. If outwitted by a victim, as you outwitted him, sire, by escaping its deadly clutches, it has sometimes sneaked out of the marsh under a cover of darkness and claimed its victims while he or she slept. Whiter than the snowy icing on his half-eaten full-grown fancy, Fred croaked, What's to be done? Am I doomed? Nonsense, your majesty, said Spittleworth bracingly. I've devised a whole raft of measures for your protection. Saying, Spittleworth took hold of one of the scrolls he'd brought with him and unrolled it. There's a covering most of the table. Was a colored picture of a monster that resembled a dragon. It was huge and ugly, with thick black scales, gleaming white eyes, a tail that ended in poisonous spike, a fanged mouth large enough to swallow a man, and long razor-sharp claws. There are several problems to be overcome when defending against an Ickabog, said Professor Frodisham, now taking out a short stick and pointing it turned the fangs, claws, and poisonous tail. But the most difficult challenge is that killing the Ickabog causes 2 new Ickabogs to emerge from the corpse of the first. Surely not, said Fred faintly. Oh yes, your majesty, said Frodisham. I have made a lifelong study of the monster, and I can assure you that my findings are quite correct. Your majesty might remember that many of the old tales of the Ickabog make mention of this curious fact, interjected Spittleworth, who really needed the king to believe in this particular trait of the Ickabog, because most of his plan relied on it. But it seems so unlikely, said Fred weakly. It does seem unlikely on the face of it. Doesn't it, sire? Said Spittleworth with another bow. In truth, it's one of the most extraordinary, unbelievable ideas that only the very cleverest people can grasp, whereas common folk, stupid folk, sire, giggle and laugh at the notion. Fred looked from Spittleworth to Flapoon to the Professor Frodigam, and the three men seemed to be waiting for him to prove how clever he was, and naturally he didn't want to seem stupid, so he said, "Yes, well, if the professor says it, that's good enough for me. But if the monster turns into 2 monsters every time it dies, how do we kill it?" "Well, in the first phase of our plan, we don't," said Spittleworth. "We don't," said Fred, crestfallen. Spittleworth now unrolled the second scroll, which showed a map of Cornucopia. The northmost tip had a drawing of a giant Ickabog on it. All around the edge of the wide marsh stood 800 little stick figures holding swords. Fred looked closely and see whether any of them were wearing a crown, and was relieved to see that none were. "As you can see, Your Majesty, our first proposal is a special Ickabog Defense Brigade. These men will patrol the edge of the marshlands to ensure that the Ickabog can't leave the marsh. We estimate the cost of such brigade, including uniforms, weapons, horses, wages, training, board, lodging, sick pay, danger money, birthday presents, and medals to be around 10,000 gold ducats." 10,000 ducats, repeated King Fred. "That's a lot of gold. However, when it comes to protecting me, when it comes to protecting Cornucopia, 10,000 ducats a month is a small price to pay," finished Spittleworth. 10,000 a month, yelped Fred. "Yes, sire," said Spittleworth. "If we're to truly defend the kingdom, the expense will be considerable. However, if Your Majesty feels we could manage with a fewer weapons—" No, I didn't say that. "Naturally, we don't expect Your Majesty to bear the expense alone," continued Spittleworth. "You don't?" said Fred, suddenly hopeful. "No, sire. Oh, no, sire. That would be grossly unfair. After all, the entire country will benefit from the Ickabog Defense Brigade. I suggest we impose an Ickabog tax. We'll ask every household in Cornucopia to pay 1 gold ducat a month. Of course, this will mean the recruitment and training of many new tax collectors. But if we raise the amount of 2 ducats, we'll cover the cost of them too." "Admirable, Spittleworth," said King Fred. "What a brain you have. Why 2 ducats a month? People will barely notice the loss." Well, this is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, give me a thumbs up, share, comment, follow me on Instagram, hit the bell for notification, and I will see you in my next one.